Oh, so far away.
Okay, well, obviously I'm Rob Gill, for those that might be listening out there, and I'm going to chat today about the idea of perception and its place and its role that it has with public relations, particularly in terms of our branding, how we work on our branding, and how we try and maximise reputation or develop reputation. A fellow Melbourne colleague of mine, Rob Masters, and myself have come up with this idea around the fact that we put a lot of energy and effort into measuring reputation, but really when you look at the work that we do and the way that we develop campaigns and communication on behalf of organisations, we're really trying to influence people's perceptions so that that will eventually, obviously, develop or evolve what the that organisation's reputation would be. So, as I said, Rob, he works, he's got his own business, he's done a lot of government work. I've spent 10 years in the industry working, and both of us have been involved with campaigns and had this thought that really all the energy we're putting into the way that we shape the communication is around the end result or the outcome of that perception with our audiences. So really, perception's more centralised than the idea of the final outcome, which is the reputation. There doesn't seem to be a lot of academic literature that really defines perception from a PR lens. What I've discovered is that there's a fair bit of work out there around issues and crisis, but I would say that more particular is that virtually everything that we're doing in order to deliver a brand on behalf of an organisation really is around the way that we get people to perceive that brand, and ultimately they then develop what they see as the reputation on behalf of that organisation. So I reckon, and Rob agrees with me, that we spend a considerable amount of time actually shaping your audience's perception rather than shaping their reputation. So how perception currently is delivered is that typically organisations, we have our storytellers, our marketeers, our PR professionals that are developing this story or this narrative around an organisation and the brand and how we want that to be represented. Then these brands are taken to the audiences through various forms of media, most typically nowadays digital formats, and so very interactive formats. And from there, discourse develops around that brand, and from that brand, an organisation develops its reputation. People see the brand and they judge that brand based on the information that they're presented with. And that information doesn't only come, obviously, from the organisation itself, but it comes from external stakeholders. It comes from the public, it comes from the media and the way that they interpret those stories that us as the developers put out into the media space. And so from that, people come up with a reputation that obviously is based on what the brand says and what people interpret how that brand is performing. So after the brand narrative goes out there, and as I said, this digital approach to communication and mobile technology, that a lot of it is imagery. Text still has obviously a role to play, but also the way that people interact with each other, that they put into practice what that brand is the way that we are trying to shape that public reputation. Our suggestion is that perception of the brand is formed by the public's, and that formulation results in the reputation. So the perception is more the critical point, and clearly different people will interpret, the brand in a different format. We all have our own constructs of the way that we interpret information, throwing a bit of psychology here, but we all know that different things mean different meanings and have different influences on people, particularly from an emotional perspective. And so really it's that perception that we are working on rather than the end result, which is the reputation. Oh, I like these little pictures I put in there too. I'll go back to this one. Has everybody seen that one up in the top right-hand corner where the perception is it an old lady or is it a young woman that we see in that picture? And for some of us, we see the old lady. For some of us, we see the young woman, and that's all. So down here we have the cat looking into the mirror, and what the cat sees is a lion. And is that what the idea around perception is all about? Do we develop stories? Do we develop images that we want to communicate on behalf of the brand? And what we believe we're representing in the mirror is that the reality that is being taken on by people. So the perception is what influences the reality. I'm going to link it to the AFL, and particularly the AFLW and the launch of the Australian Football League women's competition last year, or this year actually, but last season. So it was launched in January of last year. And I'm going to use that as a bit of a case study, but just a bit of background information on branding. So when we think about branding, and those sort of things we look at is the expectations or the memories, the stories and the relationships that drive the decision to choose a particular company, product or service, or the assurances an organisation promises to deliver. So branding is what the organisation says, this is what we're going to do for you, or this is what we are going to present, or this is how we're going to represent ourselves, or these are the things, the outcomes that we want you as a stakeholder to get out of our organisation. So essentially, branding is what we say we're going to do. Then when we look at what the reputation is, it's what the value that's afforded to an individual or organisation based on those general beliefs, or as a number of other theorists, Johnson and Fromber, have said, is that it's how external stakeholders actually perceive the organisation is delivering on those promises. So the brand is what we promise, and the reputation is, the collective agreement around how that particular organisation delivers on what those promises are. But I like that little quote too from Warren Buffett. It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it, which can be very true in our industry. So the steps to reputation, well, really we've got to look at what's behind the evaluation of the reputation. And what Rob and I suggest is that the focus really is on the perception, which is behind the reputation. So it's the step before we, as a public, or as the public and the stakeholders and the different stakeholder groups, they formulate that reputation. Then there's a series of things that they are exposed to, which is developing their perception of that organisation. So a bit of sociology from Barbara Missels, which says that reputation is a memory tied to a specific identity. And Margaret Roos says that reputation isn't a prediction of the future, but a knowledge of the past, and a strong reputation builds on that trust. So the perception is something that occurs before the reputation actually is formulated, and it's constantly changing. So, in essence, brand is what we say we're going to do or how we want to like to be perceived. Perception is what the public actually thinks we do. And reputation is how the public then rate us against what we say we're going to do. So, the example case I was going to use was the AFL. I'm not sure how familiar most of you are with the AFL, but obviously it's very strongly promoted in Victoria and particularly those AFL states like South Australia, Western Australia, Tasmania. But obviously it does have quite an influence in New South Wales, the ACT, Northern Territory and Queensland. And I've done some papers previously on the AFL, no doubt you've read them. And what I've looked at previously is how the AFL presents itself as a social conscious, so as a bit of a community leader in topical social issues. The AFL itself, when you go to the AFL and you have a look at its website, it actually has 22 publicly released social policies, so policies that relate to the social issues and the social agendas that the communities are dealing with. So things around social respect and responsibility, child protection, code of conduct, mental health, respect and responsibility, sexuality, pregnancy guidelines, which is an interesting one, which has been and was formulated way before the AFLW came into being, social media engagement policy and vilification. What I deducted and concluded from previous research I'd done in the AFL is that it was really hard to determine whether this is a marketing ploy and a way of building a good reputation or whether there actually existed a social conscience within the AFL. What I did believe to find is that it actually chooses its battles very carefully, and those things that it knows it can have an influence that would be the majority voice in the public, it would sign on for. So more recently, the AFL was very vocal in its support for the yes vote for marriage equality. So it chooses particular issues that it knows it will get traction with and stays away from those particular issues, like environmental issues, that it knows it's hard to come up with something that's going to be a clear winner for the AFL. So looking at the launch and what I believe was a very successful first year of what was the Australian Football League Women's League, and how the AFL built this perception and maintained this perception about the league over the course of the season, which was a very short season, lasted from late January through to early April. But there was a big build-up. There was a considerable amount of effort, particularly in terms of advertising, promotion, social media, getting different advocacy groups on board to promote the actual launch of the season, that things were done very well and the perception was set that this was going to be a league that in its own right was a professional league that represented AFL football played by women. It built up rivalry between old clubs, so clubs that had rivalries that dated back, over a century, and it made sure that some of those clubs actually had women's teams. It made sure that there were women's teams that were granted licences in all the different states, so that all states were represented, but also there was that idea around the old traditional rivalries, so that there would be an inbuilt supporter base and fan system that existed for the launch of the season. It was very successful. I went to the opening game, which was a lockout. I was very lucky to sneak in through the gate, so quite possibly I was illegal in there. That was 25,000, which was quite an amazing turnout. They averaged over 10,000 at all their games. And when you think of what is essentially the most successful women's professional sport, which is the WNBA, the highest crowd they've had there is, around about 16,500, and they average just under 8,000. That is a considerable win for the AFL when you consider our population base, and this being the first year of the competition. Of course, when you look at the WNBA, they are limited by the fact that they have many more games and many more teams, but also their stadiums aren't stadiums that have very high capacities. So maybe that statistic does kind of gloss things up a little bit for the AFL. So I'll go back to that slide before I finish off with that one. So no, I can't. But anyway, what I believed about the AFL was that the AFLW season was very successful. It was held in high regard by the people that were involved with it, the professionalism of it, the dedication of the athletes that were involved in it, that the actual the competition itself met all its objectives, but perhaps the perception of it in terms of being a high-level professional skilled sport didn't match up to what was presented on game day. A lot of reasons for this. One reason being that the sport itself is quite new at the professional level, at that highest professional level. Another reason being is that a lot of people that were drafted in to play in the different teams came from professional sporting backgrounds, so females that had been professionals in other sports, and the AFL was actually quite new to them, and the game itself was quite new to them. So they were exceptional athletes, but not exceptional football players. Now, I believe as the years go on, this will change considerably, because I just know from my own experience with AFL football down here, and my involvement at a club level, at a semi-professional club level, is that the women's game and the women's interest in forming teams has just skyrocketed, and I believe that's pretty much par for the course across Australia. So eventually it will meet what has been the build-up and the branding by the AFL, and that perception, I believe, by the public has been influenced by what they saw in terms of the game, and it'll be interesting to see what the result of the reputation is for the game itself in terms of it being a professional school. But obviously there were a lot more other objectives that were involved with the game itself, in terms of the way that it was presented, the format it was presented, the opportunities that it gave a whole new player base in Australia, and also the fact that it gives very interested women's AFL footballers an opportunity now to aim for a profession in football and make it a profession where they can actually earn a bit of money. Maybe someday it might even be a full-time job for the women's professional footballers. So, just finishing off, Andre Agassi, if we remember, up here in the top next to his name, that picture of Andre when he was promoting Nike, and Andre came out with that famous quote in one of his advertisements that image is everything. And I've just changed that to perception is everything. But the interesting thing, and the recourse on that for Andre and Nike was quite considerable at the time, where people were a little affronted by this perception that Andre, being a highly regarded professional sports tennis player that was held in high esteem by a lot of people, particularly young people around the globe, would be saying things like, image is so important. What was left out of that particular argument was the fact that he was actually doing the ad on behalf of, I think it was Canon, or it might have been Kodak, but a camera company. So there was a kind of play on words that image is everything, and they were taking pictures of him, so that was an image. But poor old Nike and Andre got a bit of a bashing over that particular perception that people took at the time. Perception does become the reality, and that reality turns into the reputation, so the way that's measured. So the perception is what we're trying to do, and the reputation is how it's then measured by those particular stakeholder groups. So Rob and I are thinking that perhaps a better way to go, because we do have a lot of different measurement systems out there for reputation, that maybe we shouldn't be measuring the reputation, but we should be measuring, as PR professionals and as PR researchers, we should be measuring the perception, so the doing stage of this turning a brand into a strong reputation. And what I would like your help with, and anybody else that manages to watch this presentation, is if you can put me in touch or recommend or provide some information, papers, books that you know from a PR perspective that addresses perception, particularly perception as a management tool for reputation and branding, rather than just a perception as a response to something like a crisis or an issue that's occurred within an organisation. Also, any good theorists or authors that you know, I'd love to hear about them that you believe has, you know, a strong voice in the PR perspective in terms of perception and the way that perception is viewed with public relations. So that's me. Any questions?
I'm not sure I've got any questions, Rob, but I always thought the women's AFL promotion was very interesting from a very cynical perspective, because to me it came across they were promoting themselves as almost the first or the leaders in this equality in professional support, in sport, whereas all the other codes have beaten them to it. Now, they may ultimately be more successful if you measure success by numbers, but, you know, you mentioned the basketball, the rugby have been doing it for ages, soccer have been doing it for ages, and it always seemed to me as a bit of a cynic that the AFL was playing catch-up but promoting themselves as leaders. I'd just be interested in your perception of my perception.
Yeah, well, no, that's a really great point, and I should have brought that out, because that's one of my thought processes too, is that the AFL did, over 2 years, build up this perception that they were leaders in promoting professional sport and equality for women's sport against the men's professional sport. And this perception is something that they put out there, but you're absolutely right. There were many sports that were in front of the AFL, that developed this in front of the AFL, may not have got the exposure and the publicity that the AFL got, but hats off to the AFL for the way that they actually promoted it. That this built this perception in society that this is something great that the AFL was doing, that was unlocking, you know, opportunities for professional sport for women. In actual fact, you're right. You know, things like rugby around, cricket, and the pay deals and the women's cricket wages are considerably more attractive than the AFL at the moment.
It'll be interesting to see how it develops in the next season. Yeah, but thanks. That was really interesting.
Thanks, Rob. Kate here. Are you able to just take your slides off share screen? So just go down to where you shared the screen, and it should actually say stop share screen. So that way we can see you. Aha, awesome. Thanks. I actually had never really thought about perception and reputation. I know it sounds really stupid because they go hand in hand, but I never really thought about perception as the precursor to reputation in in that kind of way. And one of the things I think that your presentation highlights is very often we use these words, and then the question is, well, where is the research and what do we really know about this is really highlighted well. And often, as you mentioned, a lot of what we deal with in the PR space is in that marketing, or looked at from that marketing perspective where you're really trying to sell a product, whereas we're looking in more broad terms very often. So I thought it was really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That is something that I was hoping to highlight, is that the terminology that we use with branding and reputation is often, branding's what we say we do and reputation is what we hope the outcome will be. But really in between those two, I think we do a hell of a lot of work on trying to manage perception rather than manage the brand. The brand's created at the marketing phase. And in terms of publicity and promotion and communication, it's really about us massaging or managing the perception.
Do you think we do enough research into perception, and what are the issues with methods? Like, I know, we do research into how people perceive our organisation, so that's perception. But one of the questions or the common failings of PR is we don't do that evaluation enough, and marketing budgets are geared up for that purpose. So what are some of the solutions?
I really haven't put enough thought process into coming up with solutions at this stage. I personally, when I started thinking about this was about a year ago. And then when I started just doing some lit reviewing, I discovered that there was very little in this space. So that's why I'm kind of asking people if they know of authors or papers or even things that might be remotely linked. Maybe I might have been using the wrong search words and I wasn't going to the right journals. But I found very little in this space around PR and perception as such, as a way of developing reputation. It was more, as I said, the outcomes of trying to change perception when something's gone wrong. And to me, that's not actually what we do. And I don't know of anybody that has done formidable work in this space. But to me, we're actually working before there are outcomes in terms of what might be an issue or a crisis that occurs. But we're actually working on trying to develop that brand, or not develop the brand, but to promote the brand and to make sure that that brand is represented correctly on behalf of that organisation. So, yeah, I don't know whether it's done well or not. Hopefully it's not done well, and I'll come up with some brilliant piece of literature that I'll get copyright on, and I'll never have to work.
Rob, can I don't know if you have seen this book, but I love chapter 4 of that book, particularly where it talks about aligning identity, image and reputation. I think it's actually saying in slightly different terms what you've been saying. Yeah. And it's about, and I always teach, when I teach about image and reputation, I teach about the personality that leads to the identity, which is what we project, which leads to the image or the perception that's formed, and then that over a period of time builds the reputation. So I would strongly recommend you have a look at that book. I know it's not PR, but it's Cornelison, I don't know how you pronounce it, and it's in the corporate communication field, but I think you would find that most interesting how they lay it out. And I really like, it's a very linear thought process that they go through that appeals to me, and that's what I base my teaching in that area on.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Do you mind sending me the reference for
Yeah,
that?
can do.
Thanks, Lan.
Anyone else? I've got a question about self-reporting. Because the thing about perception, and you highlighted it, that image where, you know, someone looks into the mirror and they think they're a lion, but in fact they're a pussycat. The thing about the way that we survey and do research and ask people about their views about something, I think there are so many flaws in self-reporting that it's almost, the validity is very questionable. And so what we often do is we're responding to a flawed perception, and that is problematic. And so if you've got people who think that they think something about something, but really when you push them, they don't really think that, then you're devising strategies that are based on like this very baseless self-perception. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's related to this notion of what you're talking about, and it's a problem.
Yeah, that's probably true of virtually all non-scientifically based research, I suppose, where, you know, we use a degree of subjective interpretation, or we have to code in order to put a numerical value on something. And, well, I probably know I do it myself, or I can be a little bit selective in the statistics that I use when I'm teaching. Certainly when I'm doing reports on behalf of my programs for the university, it's probably, I might be fuzzing the perception a little bit. But I guess if there's enough literature around and you look at what people have written and people that might be opposing the different views, then that makes it a lot easier to come up with a more solid, you know, middle ground. But I don't know how you avoid that in the current research processes that we have. And obviously for perception, unfortunately, the literature is pretty thin on the ground that I can find. But yeah, that's a really good thought, Kate.
Just like our students who say that they self-report that they want to come to lectures and they want on-campus experiences, and then they don't turn up, you know. So there's just, you know, there's just this big gap in what people say they do, who they are, you know, and so on. But I know Deb's got a question or a point.
Yeah, I can Deb talk at the moment? She was saying that her she wasn't being heard, but I can see her question. But I think what she says is a thought for Rob in terms of a solution is that I think perception as an antecedent to reputation could well support, advocate for an integrated approach to marketing and communications. I'll take that as a comment, not as a question. That'd be right? Deb, if you wanted more, if you did want an answer to that, let me know. Yeah.
Yeah. No worries, great. I actually agree. I think that's a good point from Deb. So Katerina or Catherine, any questions? Jackie?
Nothing from my end. Unfortunately, missed most of it. I don't know what happened there. I've tried all the options and nothing was working. But thank you, and I look forward to watching the recording, and then I might have some questions for you, Rob.
Yeah, great. Just email them through. No problem.
Thanks, Rob. I've just sent you and most of the other people on the session today, I've sent you a copy of the reference.
Great. Thank you.
Jackie?
No, this is my first session, so it's illuminating. I haven't used Zoom before. I don't have any particular questions at the moment, but I just had a PhD, a student submit his PhD yesterday, in fact, and it was about the use of public relations techniques by NGOs in Bangladesh, particularly in relation to gendered violence. And it would have been really good if I'd listened to this 18 months ago, because I guess he didn't really deal with that issue. And it's going to be interesting to see if the examiners come back and, you know, talk about that as a gap within the thesis. So he's actually sitting in the School of Health rather than the School of Communication. I'm not really sure how that happened, but anyway, it's something that I'll make a note of. Thanks very much, in case the examiners do come back. And I might come back to ask you for some more of those references.
Yeah, sure. I do have, I probably have about 20 good ones, but not enough to come up with a really good, strong literature on it. All right. Well, I better go because...
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Kate, thanks for organising these all year. They've been, I found them really enjoyable.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Rob. So today's been, I think we've got 7. So we've had up to 9. So I'm going to, in the absence, Katerina, of action from the PRIA, I think I'm going to create a YouTube channel. And
yeah, Kate, on that, and that's that. Hence my email early on. So what we talked about in the last meeting, due to the whole schmozzle around the accredited degrees and cross promotion, undermining, rah rah rah, we thought this was a really good idea to get onto the national office to say, hey, to fix this, rather than an apology, how about promoting ACPRES as you've been supposed to have been doing anyway?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's now official, as most of you would have seen. Anne has resigned. Huge disappointment, but yeah, it's been hush hush. But so she's been the one who's been really flying our flag. So it's a case of getting in there. So the December one still gives us enough time. Unfortunately, with 1 or 2 days, we couldn't do anything about this one. But I reckon the December one, we could really give a big push via the national office. So I will initiate that, keep you in the loop, and hopefully we will get that going somehow. If we get some more people, it might be still safe creating our own mailing list in the meantime, just to be safe.
Yeah, and look, what I might do is I might create an ACPRES YouTube channel, so I can upload these, and then they can link to the PRIA. And if I can do that not too problematically, then we can just send out the, you know, it's a link. So that might work. We'll see.
Yeah, and that's great. See, that means we've got the resource there. If they want to link to it, they can, but otherwise we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, no worries. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for turning up.
Does this mean we're all going to be YouTube stars, Kate?
Yeah, we might all be YouTube stars.
Looking you up now.
Yes, it will be. Hopefully. You never know. We might get 3 views by 2019, but that's okay. And Leanne, I'll see you on the weekend. I'm coming to Adelaide.
Yeah, looking forward to it, Kate. Hopefully we'll get some time to catch up.
Absolutely. A few red wines. Be good.
Yeah.
See you, everyone. And thanks, Jackie. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.